So, this isn't at all what I thought this video was going to be. Not that I'm taking some big emotional take on the video topic we're about to get into, but this has obviously grown a lot larger than I intended it to be. It was originally, as you can still see in the community page, supposed to be a short video to substitute the fact that I haven't really had time to research my video essay I want to do on Barbie. I'm working on that. I had to wait until March for a book to come in that I wanted to read for it. I have that book now, so I have to actually read that. But life has been absolutely crazy the last couple of weeks for me, as I mentioned it would be, and it's been forever since I've uploaded. And part of the reason for that isn't just that I've been busy, but that this video has just kept growing and growing and growing, and the next thing I knew, it was one of the longest videos I've written, and now that's what you guys are watching. And it also kind of changed endings a lot from what I intended. I've been homesick a lot this last week, and I think that's partially because I saw my brother. He came to Paris with me for a week, which, that's awesome. Who gets to go to Paris for a week? But yeah, I'm missing home a lot. So join me as we talk about a show that I watched at home with my family called Dude, You're Screwed, or for you Brits, which I now have to consider because we're in much closer proximity than I used to be, Survive That. Again, this is not the tone of the rest of the video. I want it to be pretty lighthearted, but I just wanted to acknowledge that this video has grown beyond what I originally intended it to, and I hope you guys enjoy it for what it ends up being. Dude, You're Screwed is a Discovery Channel show that first aired in December 2013. It's a genre mix between a survival documentary show and a reality game show. As 5 survivalists, military personnel, ex-military personnel, and ex-cops take turns kidnapping each other for the game, where they would be dropped in a random remote location. They would then have 100 hours to find civilization without dying on their way. Or rather, getting close enough to dying that the others who weren't playing come and rescue you, meaning you lose the game. This is honestly one of the most staged shows I've ever seen, or at least one of the most apparent staged shows I've ever seen. Like, I know reality TV is always staged, but this gets extremely dumb extremely fast and runs into a lot of problems we'll get into later. But they break this down into 5 named segments that you hit on the show. The first one is the takedown. The takedown is exactly what it sounds like. This takes place at the opening of all of the episodes, and it's where they pretend to track down and capture or kidnap their friend when they don't have any knowledge that they're filming. These takedowns usually consist of one of them being at their job or on vacation or something where they definitely wouldn't expect being grabbed, and then the lads, as they call them, I realize I'm using quotation marks an absurd amount, but the show seems to have like its own terminology for everything, and I gotta share that with you. Coming up to them and being like, hey, and then usually they have a chance to run into some trap, or the lads will just tackle them. And very early on, this gets pretty insane. They have extremely elaborate traps that use stuff like tasers, and they catch people while they're naked, but this quickly becomes tiresome, and they start with an episode with Tom, which we'll get to Tom later, completely changing this format as he outsmarts them and ends up trapping the lads instead of them trapping him, and then he surrenders himself to the game. This keeps getting even more intense and ridiculous as we get into season 2, and they use gas, and explosives and more elaborate tricks to capture people or to get away from capture. Of course, all the takedowns in Season 2 are insane, but everything about Season 2 is insane. We'll get to Season 2. I'm going to be saying that a lot. There's a lot that we'll get to. But even in Season 1, the poor acting and insane staging makes the segment stick out like a sore thumb as fake, and either that can bring a little charm with the genuine camaraderie and silliness that these guys bring, or if you watch all of these back to back like I did, it ends up just getting kind of boring, as they keep trying to come up with ways to one-up the show, and it takes longer and longer to get to the actual game. But at the end of each takedown, they usually put a hood over the chosen player, put handcuffs on them, tie them up, and search them. Which brings us to the second section, search and seizure. Because, you see, once they know that they could be grabbed at any time, they just always, 24/7, are carrying around a bunch of hidden survival gear that they want to get past the search for the game. Which, like most things, this is ridiculous, but it starts out fine, clearly staged, because they're not carrying around stuff all the time. But honestly, that's okay, because the stage stuff can be kind of fun. It's a reality show. What are we doing? As long as it's entertaining, I'm okay with it. But I'm not sure this really is. As Jake, somebody we'll get to later, quickly takes it over the top with stuffing stuff up his nose and in his pants and all sorts of things. So once they get really extreme with it, it just isn't really that interesting anymore. And funnily enough, they completely drop the segment altogether in Season 2 and just have them be like, wow, look what they snuck in during the actual game, instead of dedicating an actual search and seizure segment. This brings us to the next segment, which is the drop. The drop is kind of funny because, again, to keep the logic of the show, it becomes instantly silly. The drop is a simple segment where they fly the person, still handcuffed and blindfolded, all over the world to a random location the lads have chosen and drop them. But, again, if we think about this for a second, we see after search and seizure, the characters usually go straight into a helicopter or a prop plane or whatever, and then they act like they fly across the globe, and the person has no idea where they're going, because it's also technically like a tiny part of the game I didn't mention earlier, where they're supposed to guess where they actually are. This doesn't really matter, and in some episodes they just completely forget to do it, but it's just so ridiculous to think of them taking like a helicopter and flying it from like New York to like Finland, because you can't do that. And then obviously you can't just enter countries without people knowing that you're there, or the person entering knowing what country they're in. It's silly and ridiculous, but they play it up as this kind of cool military perk. Anyway, this doesn't really matter. I just thought it was strange to see the lengths they go through for this show, which adds to the unbelievability. So after they've flown their helicopter from Utah to Africa, they simply drop the person off and fly away to a base camp. Sometimes in the more extreme locations, this also gets funny, as they have to lower people into caves or canyons, so they have to stop, set up a whole pulley, and the whole crew has to set up their cameras, and then all while they're still blindfolded and handcuffed, they get lowered down. The show is crazy. That brings us next to the survival kit, the last one before the game starts in full, and technically it happens while the clock for the game is already running. But besides any supplies they could sneak past the lads, they almost always get a survival kit with some helpful resources if they can be resourceful. Sometimes this can be actually necessary stuff like a coat when you're dropped in Finland wearing shorts, but most of the time this is just silly items that could be used for something actually pretty neat for survival tricks. Stuff like a unicycle and a urinal cake can be combined to make fire because of the chlorine in the cake and the chemicals in brake fluid. it's kind of neat. This is usually one of my favorite parts of the show because it brings some of the most fun, pointless survival hacks, which what else are we watching survival shows for if not pointless survival hacks? Though, again, most survival shows at least teach you somewhat more practical things because, like, when are you going to have a urinal cake and a unicycle in your survival situation? But still, it can be cool, especially with the creative inventions they make. The different ways they distill water, and at one point, Tom actually takes a golf club and forges it into a hatchet, and it's fun. I always enjoyed watching stuff like this and survival shows growing up, and it makes you feel like you've learned a fun little fact or something that could theoretically help or even save your life. This now brings us to the actual main part of the show, the game, taking up most of the 45-ish minute runtime that consists of each episode, the player of choice figuring out which direction they're going to head and trying to find civilization. There are usually 2 or 3 locations where they could find people within that area that they've been dropped, but it's pretty clear that there's a pre-charted path that they're going to take before the show starts, because they'll sometimes have stuff waiting at specific locations or even people waiting at specific locations despite the fact that they theoretically could have gone any direction, and I just don't think they took the time to set up stage stuff in every single location just in case. So, yet again, it's staged, but once they find their bearings and get the path that they want to make, they pretty much have to navigate the terrain, which can drastically vary, and in Season 2 there are major breaks to this formula, but they pretty much just walk in the direction that they think will get them to people, and they have to survive off the land and make shelters as they go, and this is where most of the actual survival stuff happens. We get to see them use their kit and their ingenuity to some pretty impressive and pretty funny things. They make rafts or hunt, all while they face the environment around them. This is where usually most of the actual challenge comes from, as they try to find harder and harder areas to drop each other, from dense jungles to vast deserts to pretty much everything in between. The main danger for losing the game besides time is usually vitals, which they track and show live completely accurately, I'm sure. They make sure a player doesn't get lower than I think 96.6 degrees. I don't feel like checking, or they'll be disqualified for hypothermia, and they make sure they don't get above like 102.5 or something, which seems a little high, or they get disqualified for heat stroke. They admit that these numbers aren't quite correct, but they don't want people to actually get hypothermia or anything, so it makes sense for the show. The environment almost always has extreme weather, so this is always a looming tension along with the search for food and water. Usually they're not given any kind of food or water before in their survival kit, so they have to try and stay moving for more or less 100 hours with no food or water unless they can find stuff, which isn't very good for your health or your ability to travel. This is also pretty exaggerated, but it is one of the more common worries when you get in the game. Where am I going to get water? Where am I going to get food? They also have to worry about the normal dangers of the area, predators, dangerous plants, rough terrain, and it can make a pretty compelling challenge to see these people overcome it, even if it's staged. And again, you feel like you're learning something. And even when we have some of these clearly staged things, especially as the show goes on, for the most part, it works. You get to see the personality of the person playing, as well as some pretty fun banter between the lads, however military dad-esque it is. And when we're going to new locations, having new challenges, and getting new people each episode, it makes the show overall pretty fun and good. At first. But speaking of new people, let's talk about who actually makes up the Dude You're Screwed team. Also, a quick bonus section to different parts. They do a thing a little bit in Season 1, I don't think they do it at all in Season 2, where they like interrupt midway through and show you what the lads are up to, and they might be teaching you something, like how to use an Atlisle, or they may just be like messing around shooting stuff or jumping in lakes. They don't do this very often, but I thought it was worth mentioning for the structure of the show. So now we know how the game actually works. What really matters is who is playing the game, because depending on who the episode focuses on, honestly drastically changes the enjoyment of the show. And they typically choose specific stuff for specific people. So who actually are the lads? Up first we have Terry Shapert, former Green Beret turned National Guard, martial artist, and actor. He's kind of the de facto leader of the group. He does a lot of the show's narration and feels kind of like the most responsible in a way for all of the guys. In the show, taking up, as they call it, the most maternal role, which of course they joke about because it's this show. He's just always worried about the health and situation of others. He's honestly one of the more fun people on the show. He had previous experience on the show Warriors for the History Channel, focusing on major historic wars, and, you know, I think it makes sense to put him on this show. I've never seen that show, but he's pretty charismatic, and I feel like he fits the edutainment genre well. All his episodes, he brings a fun energy where he definitely feels like he's here to do like a TV show in a good way. Obviously, almost all of these people have some TV experience. They have to put, some kind of acting in this. But Terry does it in a way that I find pretty endearing most episodes, and even when he's going full military dad with a lot of his jokes, or hitting up on some bad acting and line deliveries with the really scripted parts, it makes you kind of, laugh with him, You're appreciating his commitment to the bit. And when he's on a run, he always makes it interesting for the camera. He talks through things a lot in an entertaining way, more than a lot of the others. And even when he's just doing commentary, he feels like he's really trying to make it work as an interesting TV show. And on the episodes where he can't be there, they still end up recording parts with him after, because he's practically the lifeblood of the show. Terry is easily one of my favorite people here. Next up we have John Hudson. John Hudson is an unusual cast member because he really doesn't have any other experience in TV. He was in an episode of Ed Stanford First Man Out, a very similar show and concept that came out after Dude, You're Screwed. But outside of that, I think the dude is just kind of vibing. He's former Royal Air Corps and the only British member of the team, and he supposedly wrote the most recent edition of the SEER, or Survive, Evade, Resist, and Extract Handbook for the UK, but I couldn't really confirm this to be true from any sources other than the show, because the book itself just credits the Defense Department. But he also claims this on his website, where he advertises his other, more recent books on survival. He also, according to his website, does a lot of public speaking, and did an article for The Insider. And you know what? He's great. Another one of my favorite cast members. He also brings a bit more seriousness to the show in a good way. He does some of the best survival stuff, and I think is probably the best survivalist when it comes to anyone on the show. I can't think of an episode where he ever really struggles. He's not the most TV personality kind of guy, but he makes up for that by just being an interesting, knowledgeable guy. And I think, honestly, the stuff where he's at his worst is when it's really doing a lot of stage stuff. He just doesn't really super fit well with the more acting sides of the show. But he can still have a lot of fun, and that adds to his endearment. He's not on the show a ton, but he's always a welcome member. Up next we have Jake. Jake. What will we do with you? Jake Zweig is one of the enigmas of this show. I'm not sure if he's the best thing to ever happen to it or the worst. Jake is a former Navy SEAL, football coach, and leadership speaker, and is more or less supposed to be the most comedic of the people on the show. He's always cracking jokes and taking things a little bit more competitively than the rest of the cast when it comes to the game and the takedowns. This makes his reception and place in the show really weird, especially being that he remains one of the only people to ever lose the game. And he did so spectacularly. We'll get to that later. This makes him an almost proto-antagonist for the show afterwards, as he changes the terminology of the show in season 2 and starting to refer to other people losing the game as him winning the game, changing the entire dynamic of the show, which kind of breaks season 2, but we'll get to that. I don't think I ever really find him that funny, but he can be kind of fun to laugh at, and he's got a bold personality, and seeing him always be so full of himself and struggle makes for pretty interesting television. Plus, he's just honestly making a lot of genuinely cool things. That's kind of his specialty. They call him like the MacGyver of the show, and this makes his runs at least exciting, interesting. He's usually kind of an underdog that you're not rooting for because he's so full of himself, but he's always interesting to watch. And I'm not joking about him being a divisive character. There are only a handful of reviews on this entire show on IMDb because, again, so few people have seen it, and even fewer of these people actively use IMDb and would put a review up. But let's read this review real quick. The review title is Lots of Potential Ruined by One Cast Member. The show is mostly entertaining and has a fun premise, but is totally ruined by one aspect. The cast consists of accomplished survivalist types who provide some decent commentary while they watch their friends struggle to get out of a particular survival scenario/location and find civilization within 100 hours. That's a lot more concise of a summary than I did. Sounds decent enough, but there's one major exception: Jake Zweig. Jake is entirely inarticulate, reckless, and a flat-out jerk. He goes above and beyond to be as abrasive and unpleasant as possible, while also adding nothing of substance whatsoever. And the best part, he is by far the worst of all of the survivalists. Totally out of shape and completely out of his league compared to the others' knowledge. Watched several episodes and enjoyed a lot of what it had to offer, but I just couldn't stomach him anymore. Which, that's a surprisingly brutal review. Like, I don't know how I feel about Jake, but that's harsh. Up next, we have Matt Graham, self-described from his Instagram as something of an expert in ancestral earth skills, a runner, a TV/film presenter, and a nature educator. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, and really for my money, it's hard to gauge what is real about Matt Graham and what's part of his character that he's made out for his social media and film career. What he means by ancestral earth skills is mainly living and using techniques that earlier humans would have used when it comes to survival. He's almost always wearing clothes that he made and sandals, and he supposedly lives off the land in Utah all the time when he's not working. As they describe in the show, he's living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle 365 days a year. That's a direct quote. He also runs like nobody's business. He runs, according to the show, 50 miles almost every day in sandals. And whenever we get to see him run in the show, it's funny because seeing this guy just absolutely book it in sandals is a goofy sight. He, to me, certainly feels like an exaggerated character for TV, and I'm sure to some point he is. The episode in Utah especially always feels weird to me. Now, you may be thinking, oh, he dislikes Matt. But no, he's actually one of my favorite cast members. Maybe my favorite. He just always comes off as like a weird goofball. He's not the best at survival in very diverse conditions. Of course, according to the show, he had literally never been out of the US until this show. But that just makes for such an interesting character to watch as he tries to show off his hunting skills and fails almost every time, or even just his laugh is really infectious and fun. I've watched this show too much, and his charms are working on me because I like this guy. I like his commentary when other people are playing the game. He's just fun, and if all of this lifestyle is fake for TV, then I guess it works, because although he feels like he really should have like a pretentious or fake vibe, he just comes off as kind of an interesting, funny guy who often brings a lot of different strategy to the game, being one of the only non-military or cop people on the whole show. Maybe that's why I like him more. Up next we have Tom. Tom Tomahawk Moore certainly is a member of the team sometimes, but I don't like Tom. I don't trust Tom, and I felt this way the whole time watching the show. Army and National Guard veteran, survivalist, and author, he gives off weird old man vibes in the worst possible way, and he's just not in the show much. I can only think of him appearing in a couple episodes, and he's not in season 2 at all, meaning he only ever has one run, and we'll talk about his episode later, but essentially he doesn't do very well, and they always act so smug about him, like he thinks he's better than literally everyone there, like he's more knowledgeable just because he's older. We'll get to more about him later, but yeah, to say the least, he's easily the worst cast member of the show, and his vibes are horrendous, even out of all of these military dads. So those are the actual core members of the show, but we also have some season 2 extras because I think they realized pretty early on that it wouldn't be that interesting if we just had the same 5 people over and over, and then of course Tom doesn't appear in season 2, so they had to have some more people. We'll go over them pretty quickly. First we have Chris. Chris Swanda, presented as a good old-fashioned redneck who wanted to prove himself on the show. I can probably do his accent a little too well. I'm revealing that I'm from the South. He's a former cop, firefighter, and EMT who is now a survival teacher, and according to his Twitter, he has a 5.0 rating on Uber. So, in case you want to get him on Uber. He's also described on his YouTube as a technology creator, but I don't really know what this means because I haven't seen anything else anywhere on anything he has saying that he's made any kind of technology. So I don't know what that's about, but in the show he's pretty fun. He brings a pretty good TV show energy and blends well to the show's game and cast. I don't think he really gets a fair chance at making his episode interesting because the changes in season 2 majorly mess with his episode, and we'll get to that later. Like I said, that's my most said phrase. We should have a little ongoing counter for how many times I say we'll get to that later. And he comes back in a later episode to actually help on the planning and the monitoring of the team, and he's just pretty good and fits in well. Up next we have Casey Anderson. Casey Anderson is a wildlife TV personality, producer, camera operator, and animal wrangler, most well known for his grizzly bear Brutus, which he has raised for its whole life. who apparently, according to IMDb, appeared at his wedding, which is pretty cool. He has had his own shows and appeared as a bear expert in several shows. He was initially brought in on Chris's run as a bear expert since he was in bear country, and they consulted him to make sure that he was safe and to bring more drama to the danger of bears in the game. He then gets his very own episode to do the game, and to memory, he's fine. He comes in at a point in the show, much like Chris, where they can't really do too much with what they're given, but even then, it's not like the most boring episode. I wouldn't hold too much against him from memory, because I'm pretty sure he tried to make it as entertaining as possible. I just don't remember it super well. And last but not least, we have Tim Smith, a bushmaster and survivalist who doesn't seem to have too much TV experience. The only thing I could find was one episode of Naked and Afraid the same year he was on this show, and he's credited seemingly as a survival expert consultant, but I like Tim. I feel like he's a fun guy, and he tries to bring that energy to the show. He cracks jokes more than almost anybody else on the show, even Jake. And they're sometimes even funny, except for when he somehow still manages to run into I hate my wife humor, even though there's not a single woman present in this entire show. Which, yeah, I guess there's no female survivalists. They couldn't find a single one. But still, despite this, I think he's got a really fun demeanor and an endearing energy, especially being that his run is an especially brutal one, and he's one of the other only people to fail, and I feel like he would have been a good addition to the show if it went on for another season, and he would have balanced out Jake's antagonist jokester antics. So now you know how to play the game and who was playing the game. But to really talk about the show and get into the fun nitty-gritty of what the show is doing, we're going to actually talk about every episode of the show. You see how this got out of hand? You see how the runtime got away from me? We're already this far in, and now we're going to talk about every episode of its 2 seasons. So strap in. We're going to have fun. If you're not having fun, I'm sorry, but leave a like anyway, just because you like me. Episode 1, Volcano Nightmare. Our very first episode starts with Jake. This one probably has one of the silliest takedowns to me because they really talk it up like it's this super secret military operation. At one point they start like the little talking head segments, and one of them literally says like it's all you want to see in a Spec Ops takedown. And then all they do is get in football gear so Jake doesn't instantly recognize them and walk out onto his football field. And then they're just like, hey Jake. And then he's like, oh, and then they tackle him. That's it. This episode is probably also the craziest on Search and Seizure, and the show just starts as Jake again has stuff up his nose and in his pants, and it's just really over the top for the amount he gets searched. This episode, he's dropped in Iceland at the top of a volcano, and he gets some silly, goofy survival kit items, like a giant teddy bear, which he decides to take with him. This episode, honestly, like most episodes, the big challenge is body heat. It's very cold, and if he doesn't keep his temperature up, he'll be disqualified. But because of that, and really because Jake isn't very good at survival in these situations, he makes dumb decisions. In fact, he makes dumb decisions all around. One of the things he's given in the survival kit was a jar with the national dish of Iceland in it. Hakarl, I think is probably not how you say it, but that's as close as I can get, which is fermented shark. And Jake hates seafood. They put it in there just to mess with him, but he still could eat it, but he ends up throwing it out. He could have even used it for, literally anything else, like starting a fire, I don't know. But he throws it out just to prove that he doesn't need it because he's going to do the game without it. Which, isn't a very good sign for how much survival stuff this episode will teach us. The second big mistake he makes in the episode is he finds a sulfuric geyser and decides he's going to use the giant teddy bear to cover it, making him a heated bed for the night. And I feel like it doesn't take a survival expert. I don't know, maybe I'm crazy here. He's a Navy SEAL. I'm just a guy. I've never really been in any survival situations. But, heat from a geyser like that is from steam. And we know that steam is water. And so if hot water is absorbing into your teddy bear that you're laying on, you're going to think you're going to get wet. And then you have to get up and go from to freezing cold when you move away from that heat source. Like, it's the dumbest thing in the world, and I feel like most people would know not to do this. So, of course, Jake, not being very good at survival situations, does literally just that. He lays on the geyser with his teddy bear and is super warm that night, but the rest of the episode he is almost getting disqualified from how cold he is, and he's just crawling around. He's miserable. Then he just so happens to stumble upon civilization with hardly any time left, but somehow it's scripted. He instantly knows about the trap that's going to be there as a bunch of people dressed as Vikings come out and attack him. The lads show up, they joke about it, the end. Episode 2, Embrace the Suck. In this episode we follow Terry in what seems at first like it would be one of the best episodes, but it still suffers from some of the weirdness that makes the episode feel so scripted. The takedown is weirdly homoerotic as they get Terry while he's stripped down for some reason, which then means that they don't even have to search him because he doesn't have anything on him. What makes this episode so interesting compared to the rest of the show is instead of being dropped on land somewhere, Terry is dropped in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico with a little life raft and minimal supplies. This is cool because it feels like a semi-realistic survival situation. He must navigate not freezing in the water and making smart decisions to move him towards land. Plus, Terry is just someone you want to root for more than Jake. He ends up making it to land in the form of a small deserted island, which is where the episode starts to go a little downhill in a couple ways. First, that once he gets there and gets some water and figures stuff out, in a real survival situation, he would want to stay there and make a signal fire, because he's in the Gulf of Mexico, presumably pretty close to other land, so people would definitely find him if he made a signal fire. But to keep the game more interesting, he wants to keep going in hopes to find people. Fundamentally, that mindset turns me off to the show a lot. This leads to a lot of weird things throughout the show where they do decisions that are better for the game, but not actually better for survival situations, which just isn't really what I'm here for. But this brings us to the second weird thing, as because Terry is so close to other land and seems like he's about to just float out again on the raft, the lads actually show up and pop his raft while he's not looking, making it the first official sabotage of the game because they realized the challenge was too easy. This then leads Terry to spend a whole day building his own raft and feeling discouraged. He then floats out and is miserable and is freezing. He practically ends up timing out, but eventually, at the last second, he just barely sees a boat, which apparently qualifies as making it to civilization. And they come and pick him up. Remember the circumstances in which he gets a win here, because this will be important later. Ultimately, the unique challenge doesn't feel like it's fairly tackled and ends up kind of feeling just depressing and scripted, which is sad because the first half of this episode is honestly super fun. Episode 3, Green Hell. Matt! Look, guys, it's Matt. Look at him run. Isn't that so fun when he's running? That's so fun. This is a pretty fun takedown. They get him while he's running, which means he gets to run away, and then it takes him a long time to get him, and it's fun because it's Matt. Then he gets trapped in Costa Rica in thick, dangerous jungle where speed really isn't a factor with the foliage being so dense. This episode, in my opinion, is just a great example of the show being really decent. It's not perfect, but Matt is fun to watch. This is a pretty balanced challenge, and he spends most of his time worrying about real survival situations and real skills. And the drama of him not being able to find enough food and then falling in the river and hurting himself is actually pretty interesting. I don't know, is him hurting himself being interesting bad? I don't know what the situation with that is. It's like my dad, this is a weird side tangent that I'm adding in right now, used to watch NASCAR a lot, and I always felt kind of bad because the only part that I found interesting was when there was a crash, and I'd get really excited when there was a crash. And me and my brother used to play a game, Crash Cars, where we would just make our little toy cars crash. I don't know if that says good things about me. But anyway, him being without food and hurt makes the mistakes that are made feel weighty. He spends quite a bit of the episode trying to hunt with zero success, which I find interesting too because I don't actually know the logistics of just showing up in these filming locations and actually hunting animals. I don't know if they had to get permission for that, but he just never kills anything in this episode, so maybe he didn't have permission to, or maybe he just needed food and was hurt. But I guess it doesn't really matter. This episode has a little cutaway with John, our Seer Manual man, showing us how to build a tent. So that's cool. I like learning how to build things like tents. Ultimately, the episode ends up being a little long. I feel like almost every episode, Matt ends up stumbling onto civilization at the last second. He also makes a weird little joke about the woman he finds on a horse being hot. And I don't know, it just feels like it comes out of nowhere for my boy Matt. You know, I wouldn't want him making all this military dad-like humor. I'm very, very disappointed in Matt Graham. Episode 4, Conquering Alaska. I would say the show has fully hit its stride here with 2 pretty decent episodes back to back. These ones make me feel like I would kind of want to watch this show. I don't have much to say about this episode, and I think that's kind of a good thing, because with this kind of television, it should be just mostly mindless fun where you pick up a couple of cool tips and you feel like you've gone on a journey with someone. This time that someone is John, another one of our favorites. He's been dropped in Alaska, which is interesting because his whole thing is freezing weather survival, making this not really fit the rest of the show's bit of trying to put people in the opposite environment than what they're used to. But honestly, because he's so good at surviving in these conditions, I think it's great. We get lots of cool tips. We get to see him make really good use of his survival kit. He's making fires. He's making teas. I guess the producers didn't think this made for super interesting television because the monitor crew are doing nothing but trying to sow doubts about the temperature and how much trouble he's in, even though he really does not seem to be struggling at all. But, you know, it's John. He's really good. The episode also takes a break in the middle to go off on some teaching escapades with the lads. I think this is again because they didn't think they had enough to fill up the runtime with John doing so well. But ultimately, John finishes with a great time, with a really upbeat, inspirational ending that most of these episodes try and do, showing that they've not just grown personally, but they've also grown together as a group. How sweet. Episode 5, Dead Man Walking. Oh boy, it's Tom's episode. How exciting. Let's read the episode description real quick. It says, Army veteran Tom is captured, hooded, handcuffed, and dropped on a volcano in the wilderness of Chile. He'll need all his bushcraft skills to scale glaciers, conquer impenetrable jungle, and brave the desolation as he races to find civilization. Oh, nice. That sounds like a great episode, but I'm sorry, not to criticize the brilliant writing of whoever wrote this episode description, but where did you see Tom racing? Tom spends literally most of the episode going absolutely nowhere. He makes it down from his scary glacier, finds some water, and spends most of the entire time of the game forging a hatchet and being like, all you youngins think that they can win with speed, but I can win because I know more than them. But Tom, this simply isn't true. After he makes his cool hatchet, he tries to navigate through the aforementioned thick foliage to a high vantage point, and he struggles so much. The hatchet doesn't really help at all. So he struggles the whole way, barely goes anywhere at all, and makes it to the beach. At the beach, he falls and he gives up. And I'm not saying this like, oh man, he fell and got injured. I can't believe he would give up after getting injured. He didn't get injured. Like, it was like a minor fall. I think they wanted you to make it seem like a bigger fall, but he clearly was fine. But they make this in the show be like that he realized that he had really won because he had found such a beautiful place with food, and really for him, that's what's winning. So they do this weird little thing where they have him turn off the camera and turn off his vitals, and they're like, oh no, he's dead. Tom's dead.
Dead Tom's dead!
And they rush in, and it's just so weird because this guy is like, again, an old shady private military contractor, and maybe he wasn't the best idea to bring on this show, but then they frame it in this epic way where he's the real winner, and it's just so ridiculous. He literally says the line, this is winning, this is how I win. He says, this is how I win. They all come in concerned, and he's sitting there and he's like, haha, the fools, I'm too powerful for your game. That's not the voice I did for him earlier, and neither of these voices are his voice, but still. This is after the takedown I mentioned earlier, where he captures them instead of him capturing... He captures them instead of them capturing him, because he's just a total badass who doesn't follow the rules. This episode sucks. It's almost more interesting than most of the show, but not in a good way. It's interesting just to see how bad he is, just how little he tries, and just how hard the show tries to justify it all. But it's kind of an embarrassing episode for an increasingly embarrassing show. Episode 6, Arctic Disaster. Let's go. It's Matt again. Matt. And, I think they realized that his running skills were a bit overpowered, and they continue in this episode to torture him for it. The takedown in this is kind of interesting because they build an entire covered hole trap, like freaking Swiss Family Robinson 1960 starring John Mills, for all you sickos who know that movie. It's a good thing that Matt just so happens to run in the one spot that they built it, but, So Matt gets sent to Finland, which coincidentally, while I'm writing this video, several of my friends are in Finland. They did an ice bath, so that's crazy. Honestly, this episode is one of the hardest challenges of the entire show, and we'll see why in a second. They didn't take anything from Matt because of this, and just straight up gave him a bunch of useful tools and warm clothes so he wouldn't die. But again, that reason is because this is so difficult, especially for Matt, whose major skill is running, and they've put him in the middle of the forest in waist-deep snow. And moving through that deep of snow without a vehicle or snowshoes is next to impossible. Every step takes you the energy of like 10 steps, and you're doing them a whole lot slower. But this isn't even the big thing that Terry and the gang are worried about. They're mainly worried about the fact that Russia is super close by and that there could be dangerous animals in the area. Those two things are unrelated. It's not like Russia brings the dangerous animals. It's just there are dangerous animals and Russia. Obviously, this wouldn't be an actual issue, at least the Russia thing for the show, because, again, we know these are scripted and we know these are pathed out. I just thought it was very notable how much they hype up how dangerous it is that they're so close to Russia, and that if Matt just so happened to wander past the Russian border, there would be no way for them to pick him up without an international incident, probably starting World War III. And he doesn't have any of his papers with him, so Russia might just lock him up forever, or even worse. This is just a weird tension builder that is especially odd living in Europe right now with the Russia-Ukraine stuff still happening. I feel like not many people are talking about it still because there is even more crazy stuff happening in the world with, Gaza and everything. But yeah, the Russia-Ukraine stuff is still going on, but I digress. These issues, as I said, never come up in the episode, but it's still one of the hardest to watch as Matt barely gets anywhere, struggles to make snowshoes, and in general just has a hard time. And since there's literally nothing out there, it doesn't make for a very interesting episode. Right at the last minute, when everything seems to be going wrong, Matt straight up abandons his snowshoes because he built them so poorly, and he just so happens to stumble on a little camp out in the middle of nowhere. And I'm so torn about it because I hate to see an ending that feels unsatisfying. In reality, he definitely should have lost this one, and I would also hate to see my boy lose. So what can we do? Not make very compelling episodes of television, I guess. Episode 7, Deadly Inferno. Now we've reached the season 1 finale, and I think they do a pretty decent job of making it a grander episode, which is funny when you have a show like this. First off, they have John again, which is great. We double up on episodes this season with arguably the 2 best cast members, and they go all out for the stage takedown and have them get John while he's at a dentist, and they drug him. And it's funny that they use this big drugging him takedown for this, because it really seems like it would be a great setup for John then to wake up somewhere already dropped off. Obviously this isn't realistic, but it doesn't have to be. This is already all staged. It would be narratively pretty fun, but then they just do it like a normal takedown, like they don't have him wake up in the middle of where they drop him. I thought this was a big wasted opportunity if we're doing crazy scripted stuff. Anyway, they take him to Utah and lower him down into a canyon. So again, pointless for the gas stuff. It's just completely unrelated. The other fun thing they do this episode, since it's the finale, is for the survival kit, they use items from all the previous survival kits. We have the raft and the golf club and all sorts of stuff. It's nice to be able to see John using these different items in a different way than the previous episodes that they were there, and this kind of unique challenge. Because this time, John doesn't just have to find civilization, but he has to get out of the canyons, which isn't always very easy. After that, it's a pretty standard episode for the season. We have lots of hyping the danger of the area, showing videos of flash floods that sometimes come through. We have John, who is one of the more knowledgeable people, showing some fun tips like how to best eat a cricket and how to get drinkable water from your sock. But he's not perfect. He still ends up making some dumb survival decisions. And not only that, but he stumbles upon signs of human life way before I think they planned him to. Like in the show, I don't think they planned for him to stumble on this that fast, but at this point, you never know. But he stumbles on some tracks in the desert, and Matt, who's from Utah and planned the route, is like, nah, those aren't recent tracks. People definitely aren't around. I promise, there's nobody around. This is actually a remote way. Either way, this ends up leading him directly to a very much planned ending in spectacular season finale fashion. Riffing off of the catastrophe of Tom, John finds people who are specifically friends of Matt, who he then convinces to take him to the lads' camp and take their virtual tracker and vitals on a horse and run off, which is funny and shows how faked the vitals are, because horses' vitals and human vitals, I feel, would not be the same. But he ends up sneaking in the camp and gets an epic, honestly pretty easy victory for John, who is probably our peak competitor. It's not great because of how scripted this episode feels, but when it's just John doing his thing and having stuff like reused survival items, it's a nice way to round out the season. And starting off, we have episode 1, Epic Fail. And this is kind of the episode that changed everything. It was the episode that upped the absurdity, upped the challenge, upped the drama, and gives us the first real loss of the series that would make the foundation of the episodes moving forward change. What a way to start the season. This is another Jake outing, and right from the get-go, the intensity this season is raised. We've gone from a TV PG to a TV 14 for coarse language. So, yeah, you could say it's pretty epic. That might come to mind. And our new intro has actually upped intensity too. And oh look closely and you'll find that one of our cast members is missing. I wonder where Tom went. But with the added intensity, our takedown is even more absurd, being at a fake funeral where Terry plays a dead body and every single person at the funeral is in on it, making it so far in the show the most extreme takedown. There is no search and seizure, and they drop Jake in Namibia, Africa, which honestly, rightfully this time, they say might be one of the deadliest places they've dropped anyone. The show goes through the typical motions for a bit with the survival kit, yet again having a fish joke to mess with Jake for not liking fish. Things on the whole, though, seem to be pretty okay. Jake being his typical Jake self, unashamedly playing the game on the game's terms, not looking out for the best survival decisions, but to be the coolest in the game. He decides to travel during the day, a thing, again, I think most not even survival people would know is not what you want to do in the desert, and he lugs around a sled built from things from his survival kit, though he pretty quickly gives up on this because of all the extra energy he used. At the end of the first day, he's only gone 5 miles. He gets up when the sun is already rising. It's a brutal walk in the daytime. He goes across several presumably staged signs of death, like a crashed airplane and human bones, and he finally decides to get out of the heat. He then travels for the next night, but he really needs food by the 3rd day. He finds some fruit out in the desert, and he tries to do the universal taste test by testing to see if it's poisonous. Ultimately, he tries to eat it. He then walks all throughout the day because of the poor time he is making, and it's really just brutal to watch. It's not fun to watch him just like suffer in the heat. But he finally arrives at a beach where, again, there's no people and no real food. In fact, he finds a bunch of seal skeletons. So clearly something is there that's eating them. And that night, I cannot confirm if this is staged or not, he wakes up feeling like something is sniffing his foot. We do actually see that there are animals out there. We see some jackals the next day. But I don't know if one actually sniffed his foot. That seems unlikely to me. But yeah, he can't really stay here. But all hope is not lost at this point, because if he heads north, he will end up finding civilization. And this is really interesting because to this point, I would say that almost all of these paths clearly felt planned out, like they had talked with people beforehand. So I don't know if it was like planned for Jake to do really bad here or not, but Jake ends up going south, and he will find nothing south. He spends almost an entire day trying to distill some seawater, barely getting anything to drink, and he's getting so bad vitals-wise that he starts literally just eating random plants that he finds on the beach. Again, this is very unpleasant to watch. His time is almost up, civilization is nowhere near, and because he started eating random plants, or maybe even from the fruit he ate the day before, he starts throwing up. Like, a lot. He tries to keep going, but he just keeps throwing up, getting rid of almost all of the nutrition and water that his body had left. He tries to write DNR in the sand for do not rescue and press on, but eventually, due to the danger of the situations, the lads come and Jake loses the game. I know this was a bit more in-depth than I had gone with some of the other episodes. I think a lot of these Season 2 episodes are going to be like that because Season 2 they do things a lot crazier. But this really is one of the, if not the most important episode of the show moving forward. I mean, again, think this through. The amount of times in the show we've seen people barely come close, about to time out, and they just stumble upon things. We've never seen failure on this kind of level. They always luck out or do whatever the heck Tom did, but not this time. Not only that, but this is some of the worst medical conditions that we've ever seen anyone get to, and the more deadly animals than almost anybody has ever come across. It really is just one of the most brutal environments, and it almost seems mean. I mean, I may not like Jake that much, but seeing him done like this in an episode is brutal, and I can't tell if it was scripted to be that way. Maybe it was, because as we'll see, this failure ends up being a massive catalyst for change moving forward in the show, but I cannot understate how much of a jarring episode this is after coming through all of Season 1. Episode 2, African Ambush. Episode 2 starts off pretty normal. They trick Matt into thinking that they're trapping John, but actually they're trapping him, and this means they don't have to worry about his little fast running skills. And then they take him to Africa. I'm guessing maybe for budget reasons they decided to do 2 episodes while they're in Africa, which makes sense, but I think it's a little funny having them pretend like they've gone, to Africa and then back, and now back to Africa. But anyway, this time they're taking him to Tanzania. They drop Matt off again, giving him some tools for hunting, since there are so many animals, and Matt is pumped for like the first time in the show. He just seems super excited, and it's easy to understand why when you actually see where he is. Because where they dropped him in Tanzania is pretty much completely flat, open space, and Matt is a distance runner. This is the first time in all his episodes where they've actually dropped him someplace where he can use his one big skill. They even dropped him in sight of Mount Kilimanjaro, which if he moves towards, he will find civilization. But in his survival kit, he has stuff to make arrows, but no bow for them. And this is all part of Jake's secret plan this episode. As Matt is about to make plans to, of course, run towards the giant mountain in the distance, the lad's helicopter turns back. Jake leans out and has a bow and gets low to show it to Matt. Matt actually ends up literally jumping up and grabbing it while Jake is still holding on to it, but I'm sure this is all scripted. You can actively see Matt's not pulling on the bow or anything, but still. Jake then gets away and goes and drops the bow on a hill away from Kilimanjaro. From there, Jake is hoping Matt will see a riverbed that's beyond this hill that doesn't lead towards anything, but a riverbed might have water, and he needs water, so he's hoping this will take him off of the immediate path. And it works. Matt goes and gets the bow, of course, and when he sees the riverbed, he heads towards it. Oh, also they give Matt raw cow's blood because it's drinkable, and some people in Africa do drink it since it's so rich in vitamins. And of course, Matt drinks it and really likes it because he's cool. But this majorly dehydrates him because blood is so salty. Another ploy specifically to mess with Matt's chances, not to give him the tools to make him do good, which is just kind of odd given that it's the survival kit. He makes his way to the riverbed and finds it completely dry. He even ends up spending a long time trying to dig holes to see if there's any water trapped just under the surface, but digging in the dry clay makes him even more tired and even more dehydrated, and he doesn't find anything. This show then specifically shows that this is all Jake's plan after dehydration was the major thing that ruined his run in the previous episode. Everything was set up to get Matt dehydrated and to fail, making him go longer than anyone has in the entire show without water, including Jake in the previous episode. He ends up finding some water near the riverbed anyway, so this means we've spent half of the episode not actually playing the game, but being manipulated into making poor decisions, all over something that ultimately doesn't even matter, but I can see what they're going for. I just don't think it really works, because they've now broken the formula of their own game by changing the nature of the challenge into a string of pre-scripted drama moments, and, well, you'll see what I mean when we move forward. After getting some water and doing some successful hunting, Matt realizes that the river is gonna lead him nowhere, and with only 25 hours left, he decides to hunker down for the hotter hours of the day. Then he realizes that traveling across the savannah at night is probably not a good idea with how many predators are there, so then he goes back to his camp, goes to sleep, and gets up as early as possible. And now, with very, very little time left, we see him start stretching. And you know what that means. He changes course for the giant mountain, being Kilimanjaro, and starts running, traveling the most distance in one day that anyone has done so far in the show. And it's honestly really funny watching the cameraman trying to keep up with him. He ends up running into a small group of people, winning the game, showing how easy it would have been for him to win if they had not done all of this scripted nonsense. They also play up the danger of the African people throughout the episode, and I'll talk about this more later, but it's really, strange. They actually play it up like though Matt found people. They have to now go save Matt from the dangerous natives, so that's fun. Episode 3, Mayan Sacrifice. Okay, I swear I'm not going to talk that long about all the Season 2 episodes. Trust me, once they get used to this new formula, the show gets increasingly uninteresting. This episode is the first sign of that. We have a big over-the-top takedown with this whole fake out with a car chase. It's a whole thing, but it's not particularly exciting. But this time we're taking John and we're dropping into a cave system in Mexico. Jake becomes a true full mini antagonist now at this point, doing stuff like, for some reason, cutting Jake's rope as they're lowering him down into a water-filled cave, just for drama, to be evil, to mess with his head, I don't know. He also continues to talk about other people losing the game as him winning the game, making it more likely that the lads will be against the chosen player. But this is all just a pretty scripted, boring run. The cave system isn't very interesting. We see that there's literally a path that they've planned for him. They've put a sign in the cave to where he doesn't go the wrong direction. And once he gets out of the cave, it's just jungle, and we've already seen him do jungle. He does a couple of interesting survival things, which is John's great appeal, but there really isn't much to make it work. He then makes it to a beach and decides to make a signal fire, which no one has actually tried to do in the show so far. He ends up seeing a boat from long distance stop, which I remind you, and you guys all remember because you're very astute people, you always remember things you need to, that in Season 1, all Terry needed to do to win when he was dropped in the Gulf of Mexico was to see boats. He just barely sees a boat, which apparently qualifies as making it to civilization, and they come and pick him up. Remember the circumstances in which he gets a win here, because this will be important later. But apparently that doesn't qualify for John here, so they make him wait, and then the boat ends up sending a helicopter because he can't come through the coral reef, and John gets rescued anyway. It was a pretty uninteresting episode on the whole, because it focused more on the spooky, crazy cave system to get out of than actual survival, and they now seem to just be doing whatever they want in terms of the rules of what it means to find civilization. Episode 4, Death Row. In this episode, we have our first guest appearance in the show, and it's Chris Swanda. It's kind of funny that they frame the takedown for Chris as he was bad-mouthing the show about how easy it would be on YouTube, so they end up having to go capture him and put him in the game because, he was talking bad about him, so now they have to They have to kidnap him, like a crime. But it's funny because I'm now bad mouthing this show in an increasingly overly long rant, and I've expressed my interest in survival shows and my interest in survival knowledge. So if they decide to continue the show, you might just see me on the game because I'm bad mouthing them on YouTube. So if I end up being kidnapped, you know who's responsible. But this episode is also unique and sad for a couple reasons. They do something new this episode. Instead of dropping Chris in nature, they drop him in an abandoned prison in handcuffs and shackles, and then he also has to break out of the prison first before he can actually start his journey to find civilization. And they play up, of course, that it's a haunted prison. He ends up breaking out pretty fast, but Terry has a couple of tricks up his sleeve on the run, and the clearest path ends up being a trick. This is also the episode, as I mentioned, where they introduce Casey, which is cool because they actually do see a bear during the run. Again, I enjoy watching Chris on the show, but the poor guy really didn't get much of a chance. He gets literally led around trick after trick, actually walking around in circles. He brings some cool survival hacks, but it's almost a non-factor in these conditions. By the end of the episode, he's literally all the way back at the prison, and he decides to just try and light a signal fire. And, well, this ending is really something, because according to Terry, this area is a military training field, and they totally didn't tell the military that they were filming a show there. So because of the signal fire, people with assault rifles and full tactical gear show up, make them turn the camera off, putting Chris in jail, which counts as a win because he did find civilization. And it's really here that something clicked for me, that something happened to kind of break the show. Because Chris should have stood a good chance to win this normally, but this couldn't even qualify as a game at this point. He was led around non-stop and then won by some weird setup. It's just not interesting when they do it like this. Episode 5, The Hunger Game. Man, these episodes are boring. I may not have loved season 1, but I could at least remember them pretty well. Without the descriptions and my notes, I really couldn't tell you what happened here. But we have Casey, who appeared last episode and now is getting his own episode. They use his bear as part of the trap by leading him into another pen that he's not usually in, and then they make like a fake bear trap. I don't know. They end up dropping Casey in British Columbia because it's a very bear-infested area, and this whole episode is just all bear-themed. He's constantly saying things like, well, bears do something, so I will do what the bears do too. And his survival kit has fake bear fur, and he's just doing random stuff. Of note, they bury his survival kit for some reason, so he has to track down and then dig it up, eating into his whole time, which, again, seems super unfair given anybody else's run where they're just given their survival kit. He literally had to spend time digging it up, time that everybody else had. I don't know. This show at this point is practically incoherent for what it is. And what else happened this episode? He eats a very, very, very tiny little bird completely whole and makes some tea out of bear poop. So yeah. Anyway, he eventually finds a river, and the river has kayakers, and they do the exact same thing where he sees the kayakers, but instead of qualifying that as a win, he has to actually get them to stop, which is really annoying because it just wastes like 5 minutes as he's like worried they won't stop, and then they just end up stopping. Episode 6, Pain in the Neck. Just like this show. Wow. I think at this point they were just really desperate to do something interesting with all these tricks and changes they're doing, I guess to try and get the audience more engaged. But by tipping their hand too much, they've only made it so much less engaging. So in this episode, they do something they've never done before to really shake things up. This is Terry's episode, and, well, there are two things we know about Terry from, the character we all love. First, he always plays up his fears of the supernatural and, spooky stuff. Second, he is like the maternal character of the show. He's always trying to take care of people, and he's worried about other people's safety before his own. And knowing these two things, what could we do that might make for a more interesting episode? That's what we could do. We could give him something to take care of and drop him in Transylvania, because vampires. So they give him literally a teeny tiny little puppy to take care of in the episode, and that's kind of fun, because, how can it not be when you have an adorable puppy? He does often go out of his way to take care of the pup before himself, because, yeah, of course, you kind of have to do that. Ultimately, however, not that much happens in the episode. The survival kit is all vampire themed, so with Romania's rather unique looking landscape, you can pretty easily guess where he is. Oh yeah, and for some reason, I should mention this, again, just another weird thing that they do. They put his survival kit at the shore next to this lake, and then drop him into the freezing cold lake. This slows him down a bit and starts him off freezing cold, so he has to instantly start a fire and take off his clothes and dry off. But other than that, it's completely pointless, other than just a time waster, so I don't know. Every night they play up his vampire fears. They have Terry actually act like he had a nightmare where some kind of pale figure showed up to his camp. But the really big problem facing Terry is one of food. He's got enough food for the dog, but he's really struggling to find anything making him sluggish and making him make worse decisions. But he actually does some pretty cool tracking, which is neat, and he shows us how to use a rosary to kind of map around. He ends up getting a little bit to eat and making his way exactly to where the lads wanted him to go, to a small village in Romania, and specifically into a cathedral, which a reviewer actually pointed out, kind of funnily enough, that they really play down the size of this town. Like, if you look up the town that they're at from the show, it's like a full-on town, there's people there, cars, it's like a big place. But in the show, they really go out of their way to be like, oh, it's like this abandoned town. And I just thought that was kind of funny. Anyway, in the cathedral, they have a bunch of people dressed up like vampires. So that's cool, I guess. Isn't that so spooky? The best part of the episode is that we get to see that the cameraman got to adopt Rosie the dog, and she looks super happy, which is awesome. Episode 7, Island of Death. Jake is back after his run of actively rooting against and sabotaging everyone after his brutal loss. This time he has a very similar challenge to Terry, but instead of dropping him directly into the ocean on a small raft, they put him on a small island instead. He's really obviously looking to prove himself this time around, having been the only one to actually fail this point in the show. He actually does some pretty cool survival stuff, building cool things, which is more or less what he's best at in the show. But they are immediately on with the sabotages by setting up a light on a nearby island, tricking him into thinking that there are people there. So he spends an entire day building a raft, which I will say is literally one of the coolest things anyone's built the entire show. Like, it's genuinely just a really well-constructed, cool raft. But this sabotage actually ends up being like a kind of lead path thingy, because he hadn't even figured out that what he was on was an island yet. So it's, cool that our survival characters never get to make any survival choices. Anyway, he spends a lot of his time finding ways to get food and water, and ends up barely making it back to the mainland of Nicaragua. So because he's running out of time, he literally steals a horse and rides it to victory, finding the horse's owner. Wow, what a nice run. I should have never doubted Jake. Episode 8. No. Sorry, that's really not fair to this episode. No Sleep Nightmare. No Sleep Nightmare, more like I want to fall asleep in this show is a nightmare. Anyway, this is the last episode of the season, and unlike last time, they didn't do any kind of big, fun season finale episode. In fact, they don't even have one of the main cast members. They have Tim. But hey, Tim, as I said, is pretty fun. And it seems like this one will be a nice, interesting, if not odd, season finale. They drop old Timothy off in Norway during the summer solstice. The big challenge of this one isn't the same as most other episodes, as it's pretty easy terrain to navigate, not very abrasive weather. But unfortunately for Tim, and our enjoyment, the sun never goes down during the summer solstice where he's at, so he has no way of telling when he needs to go to sleep or how long he's been asleep. Sleeping out in the open absolutely wrecks your body's internal sleep clock and can lead to some big problems, which it does. Tim walks throughout the entire night, though he doesn't even realize it, and this is easily the best part of the episode because he's awake, and we get to see him doing fun survival stuff and goofing around with what he got in his survival kit, including a coracle, which I love coracles. That may seem like a little bit strange, but I just genuinely, I really like coracles. I think Narnia did this to me. But after the first day, where he takes his coracle around like a Ninja Turtle and jokes about it, he finally gets to sleep for 2 hours, but he doesn't know if this was the right time to get to sleep or how much sleep he actually got. He then is increasingly sleepy and continuing on, unable to know how much time has passed, how much time he has left, how much time he slept, and it's really, of course, brutal to his body. His body rarely lets him sleep more than a couple hours each time, leading him to fall asleep almost every time he stops. And this is actually a really interesting challenge to watch unfold because it's unlike anything else you could really get anywhere else. But it does have the unfortunate side effect of Tim either being incredibly sleepy or actively asleep, therefore not as funny or interesting, taking out the enjoyment of one of the more enjoyable personalities that they've had on the show. He ends up making it through this brutal sleep all the way to a river, which he can use the coracle to float all the way to see a street, which would lead him to civilization. There's actually a hole in the coracle, and he uses a cool trick to patch it. Then he goes out on the water, but unfortunately, now that he's not moving, he finds it extremely hard to not fall asleep and ends up sleeping right past when he could see the road, which I don't think was actually planned. This might be, honestly, the big thing that I think is not staged, because this actually really worries the lads, and they have to quickly go down and get further beyond the river than him, and have to wake him up and catch him before he gets to a dangerous waterfall. I say I don't think this is scripted, mainly because of the tone in which the rescue is. Like, they're genuinely yelling, and like they seem very intense and very actually worried. These guys aren't very good actors, so I don't think this was actually scripted. I think this was just that brutal of a challenge. So, unfortunately, Tim does not win. They get him out of the river safe, which is good, but, you know, it's the only other loss of the entire show. And he was put through this brutal sleep. I think, honestly, out of anyone, Tim probably deserves a second chance. I'm not sure literally anyone could have done better on this course. You've probably never heard of Dude, You're Screwed, and if so, I wouldn't really be surprised. And the story about how I found it is about as uninteresting as it gets. But for a little backstory for this whole video, growing up, my mom was super sick a lot and struggled with depression. Giving birth to me kind of threw everything off in her chemically, so I grew up spending a lot of time at the foot of my parents' bed doing homework and watching TV with her. One of the main things we watched were survival shows that were on at the time. Shows like Survivor Man and Man vs. Wild, which when looking this stuff up, I found out that Survivor Man is still running somehow, and Man vs. Wild just ended in 2020, which illustrates that when you have a decent idea for a survival show, it really doesn't take much for it to be on network TV pretty much forever. Pretty much all survival shows at the time ran on Discovery Channel, and they were fun to watch as a kid. I felt like I was becoming an expert alongside these guys doing stupid, crazy stuff in beautiful places. Sure, a lot of these shows, like all reality TV, were staged, but their goal, more or less, was to teach you things while you were entertained. Like Wildcrats, but for people who just really wished they went outside and hiked more. Anyway, this was a little before Dude, You're Screwed's time. This is just to say that I was familiar with the genre, and my mom and I had always watched them together. So cut to probably the late 2010s, and I'm working from home, and so is my mom. So we both often work in the living room, and from time to time we'll binge through some TV shows while we both work. Stuff like the 1 million seasons of Criminal Minds, or whatever other mindless shows we can find. And we were scrolling through the endless stream of streaming service nonsense, and we stumbled upon a show called Dude, You're Screwed, and of course joked about the title, and then jokingly turned it on to see what the heck it was. And then of course, we watched the entire show, which wasn't too hard because there were only 2 seasons, which isn't a good sign when we've seen how long these shows normally last. We thought it was a pretty crazy show, honestly. Cut to 2024, I'm looking for a fun, short video idea that wouldn't be a full-on video essay, and I see on HBO Max, Dude, You're Screwed again. And I remember how weird it was, and I knew I had to share it with you guys. And that was it. The show quietly disappeared in 2014 without much fanfare. If we check out their Facebook, as early as 2015, they were posting ads for a different show called Bushcraft Build-Off, which for some reason I put in my notes as Butchcraft Build-Off, which would be a very different show, I feel. I don't know what that... I feel like that's a good setup for a joke, but I'm not clever enough to make one. They used this Facebook pretty much solely to promote this other show all the way up until 2017 when it went pretty much inactive. But how could this happen? How could this show of this magnitude and honestly this amount of goofiness so quietly and quickly disappear when we've seen so many of these shows seem to just live on forever? Well, let's look at some of the reasons. An undeniable thing about television in the broadcast era. Remember when so many people would still tune into stuff live and streaming services pretty much only had reruns? That was a crazy time. Anyway, an undeniable thing about television in the broadcast era is that ratings were important. If you didn't have good ratings, the only thing that could really save your show was that you had enough people hate watching or casually watching that networks wouldn't really care. So how were the ratings for Dude, You're Screwed? Well, honestly, I can't find too many ratings for this small of a show at the airtime, and really in general it seemed to not have that much conversation around it at all. I did find a site called The Futon Critic, which says that as early as December 2013, when the show first aired, it had a 0.62 rating. I wasn't too sure what this meant relative to other TV shows, but luckily it lists other popular TV shows at the time. The number one slot was the NFL Post Game, which had a rating of 6.95. The number two, also being football, having a 6.92. This seems to be a pretty high score, as most of the other shows all fluctuate around 2 to 3, Naked and Afraid getting a 1.01, which doesn't speak well for not even getting a 1. In the streaming era, which seems to be where the show has found a little bit more stability and an audience for itself, but even then not much, IMDb gives it a generous 7.7 out of 10, but that's with only 638 votes, so this number is pretty skewed, and the reviews, as we've seen, are mixed at best. The folks down at Common Sense Media didn't seem to think too much better, giving it a 3 out of 5, but the one-sentence top review of the show made me laugh. It's just, interesting survival concept showcases skills. Respect. I found a brief Variety review from before the show came out, pretty much just saying it seemed pretty cute and harmless, but the Discovery and Animal Planet seemed to just be banking on and picking up off of the success of stuff like Naked and Afraid and the really eye-turning titles. Apparently 80% of the Google users liked this show, but I'm not sure where Google gets that data from. Amazon ratings follow suit with a 3 out of 5, and there's also some particularly notable reviews that I'll get to in a second. There's also an interesting New York Times article that was written around 2013 talking about the rise of popularity of shows similar to this and the kind of sad thing they represent, less focused on the survival trip and more on pushing people in reality TV to the point of actual injury or mental strain for views, talking about the death on the French version of Survivor and the countless injuries obtained on shows like Naked and Afraid, and that this show specifically takes it to such an extreme by framing it in the game so they really don't want to get rescued, like with Jake in the Desert, or even just the fact that, Tim really could have been seriously injured or worse. I don't think, though, at this point, the concerning nature of reality TV had rooted itself too far into public consciousness at this point. I don't even think it's really that far in public consciousness now. There's a whole conversation to be had about reality TV and true crime and its exploitative nature, but this was peak time for shows like Naked and Afraid. This kind of negative view towards reality TV like this is important to note because it would become more popular in mainstream audiences as we move forward. This section will be pretty brief because it's kind of equally hard to find viewership numbers for obscure TV shows from 10 years ago. The Futon Critic on the same page also has viewership numbers to go along with it. If we check here, we can see that at the time, according to these stats, Dude, You're Screwed had 1.378 million viewers, with 0.429 million of these guessed to be between the ages of 18 and 49, which I think is important for advertisers. And again, I think this is pretty respectable. It's doing better than something like Guy's Grocery Games, which had 1.227 million viewers overall. But even compared to Naked and Afraid, a show that didn't have too much overall higher ratings, Naked and Afraid was pulling in 2.438 million viewers, with 1.284 of them being adults ages 18 to 49. Almost all of Dude, You're Screwed's entire viewership. And the streaming age really isn't any more favorable to who is watching it. I mean, the reason it's so hard to find so many reviews or star averages is that so few people have actually taken the time to review it, meaning one of two things. One, a ton of people have watched it and just didn't put on a review, or instead of putting up something on Amazon or IMDb, they just didn't really think about it or decided against it. Or alternatively, nobody's watching it. Seriously, I doubt if anyone subscribed to me right now has ever heard of this. The last main number factor that I want to consider is just the popularity of survival shows in general. Now, I said earlier that this was around a peak time for Naked and Afraid, the most prominent show of the 2010s to get people into survival reality TV, but if we take a look at the viewership that I went over earlier, we can see that this viewership is for the episode Double Jeopardy, which was the Season 2 pilot. This was when everyone was still talking about it because it really did have an eye-catching name, but it only got 2.438 million views. This is good compared to the other low-viewed shows at the time, like Dude, You're Screwed, but even getting just a little bit higher in popularity, the number goes up exponentially. Naked and Afraid on this list is ranked at number 19 most popular in terms of, I guess, just what they had right there. And if we go up 3 slots to the number 16 most popular show, Revenge, it has 6.040 million viewers. People seem to like the show pretty okay, and it had a pretty great audience to adults, which was nice for advertisers, but this isn't actually saying that it was that popular of a show, and this was close to its peak popularity. After Naked and Afraid got some popularity, people were starting to talk about survival shows a lot, and there were a lot of imitators and spin-offs, and really just a big increase in more crazy survival shows, like Dude, You're Screwed. But this oversaturation of the market that was barely stable enough to be called successful means that it really wouldn't grow much more than its already set up loyal fan base, which usually is enough for smaller shows on stuff like the History Channel or Animal Planet, but when, for a moment, because of a slight increase of popularity, it becomes a relatively competitive market, we would see a lot of shows come very quickly and be gone very quickly, with really only the ones that were already pre-established before this big boom maintaining the test of time in terms of consistent viewership and ratings. Honestly, it's just not that interesting. It honestly feels kind of silly having to put this in here because we've seen, having worked through episode by episode of the entire show, that even towards the beginning of season 1, it really struggled to be that interesting for all of its runtime. And by the time we get to season 2, when it's not utterly ridiculous, it's genuinely just really boring. And I think this is because they fundamentally didn't know what they wanted the show to be. Or maybe to a lesser extent, didn't understand what makes a survival show really that interesting, or even a reality game show that interesting in the first place. So let's talk about who is actually behind the show besides just the cast of it. The executive producers are Scott Freeley and Scott Madden, which, both of them being named Scott, was already a red flag. Sorry to anyone named Scott in the audience, maybe get a different name. Scott Freeley is pretty successful and a pretty prolific television producer with over 50 credits on IMDb, including working on shows like Cake Boss, Fixer Upper, and even some recent shows like Super Hot, The World of Pepper People, and How to Build a Sex Room. Scotty Madden is a writer, director, producer with really not much work to their name. They directed The Kiss, a low-budget vampire movie, and a Hot Tamales, Live, Spicy, Hot, and Hilarious. And I think those are the biggest credits to their name. I don't want to point fingers at either of them and say that this is one person's fault or even a team's fault. Obviously, TV shows have a ton of people working on them, and success or failure can never be contributed to one individual person, nor do I think I would even call this show just a failure on the whole. There just is a lot of things that contribute to their success. The reason I mention it is because Scott has had success working with a lot of the same people and in the same style shows. So theoretically, they know how to make good reality TV. I can't say that I'm above enjoying Cake Boss, but one thing I think is notable about both the main producers of the show is that neither of them really have any history of working with a survival show or really any kind of competition show at all. There are some exceptions among Scott's work, but nothing really successful. And if we look at how the show turned out itself, I think this just wasn't their wheelhouse. A lot of the shows Scott especially worked on that are pretty good are ones about an expert doing stuff and talking about the stuff they're doing, but usually in a way that's controlled by a narrative where the very fact that they're doing the thing is interesting and carries most of the viewership of the show. I mean, why are you watching How to Build a Sex Room if you don't want to learn something about how to build a sex room? Or if you're watching Cake Boss and you're not at least semi-interested in seeing people bake amazing, beautiful cakes. You can learn something from these shows, but it's really just fun to watch people do something they're really good at. And the reason you may or may not stay with something like this on the long term is the people, the characters, the family, the microdrama, the comedy. Through learning about their specialty, you learn their personalities and grow to enjoy their dynamics.
Are you busy?
All right, I'm very busy. What do you want?
All right, well, you know what's coming up, right?
What's coming up?
My birthday?
This is simple, great stuff and works for these style shows. And it seems to me like this structure was exactly what they were going for with Dude, You're Screwed. It just doesn't work for this style show.
Use the British accent to charm them, and guess what? In the middle of charming them, he's gonna get crushed.
Again, the best parts of Dude, You're Screwed are the times we get to see just experts doing what they're good at, but in a non-stage context, and the dynamics between the lads themselves. Find them cringe or not, that's what the show is good at doing. But they seemingly do not know how to handle the game elements of reality TV at all. First, by having a cast of almost exclusively 5 people, save for some exceptions, makes for a great dynamic team you can watch work together each week, but it isn't very interesting when you're trying to see a difference in competition each time. Eventually, once they get everybody to go through an environment once, they don't have anything interesting, and they have to keep pushing for things to get more and more bizarre to where it's not just the same thing over and over and over again. And this can work when you're making a new cake every episode because each cake brings its own challenge. But there are only so many survival situations they can realistically go for in a game like this. And so as it goes on, it ends up feeling like, wow, jungle. Wow, heat. Wow, snow. And sometimes, ooh, ocean. And this hurts the show so much. And clearly they didn't know how to fix this either, doing stuff like the puppy in Transylvania and the prison in season 2. I mean, I'm not sure what else they could do because I don't think they have enough people who would actually come on and do the show to have it be like a consistent new contestant every time survival show. It just doesn't seem to understand what makes the survival part of this actually interesting, especially when it comes to portraying survival skills. I mean, I already talked about this earlier, but their survival skills beyond the game elements aren't even particularly interesting to watch because all of it's so extreme and set up and ridiculous that it wouldn't be important. And sometimes even their survival hacks and what they tell you is just fake, which is bad, like really bad. This is trying seemingly to make it more fantastical and engaging, but it just makes it all blend together because why should you care about any of their situations when you clearly can't learn anything about what they're doing and they're always in like a non-challenge scripted thing and you've seen these people before. And when they get a bad cast member, all of these problems increase tenfold. Racism? I don't know what to qualify this category as. I'm not really the person to talk about this clearly, But when watching this show, I wanted to bring it up because there's something that really kind of bothers me about how they deal with, like, natives to the different nations that they go to. I was originally just going to call this section racism, but that doesn't even really seem to be right because they don't seem to be particularly discriminating because of specific races, but more just because they're not from America in general, which I think qualifies more as xenophobia. They always just want to play up for sake of TV show tension how mysterious and dangerous the people are, no matter where they are, even in places like Finland and Romania and, Norway. They talk up the tension and the toughness of the native people and try to act like the player could be in trouble when he runs into any of them. And they usually treat the fact that they can't communicate with these people well because of language barriers and don't know that they're on a TV show as kind of like a weird distancing tool. Even Matt and the way that he interacted with the Finnish people just being like, I don't know, it was very weird toned. I don't like any of it. And they're just using it to try and add tension to the show. And this seems just like a bit of bad taste when we're in places, but it seems to be even worse whenever we're in like South America or Africa, when they can sometimes act even more extreme and really play up the danger and the violence of the people. And yeah, I'm sure there are some people in Africa who wouldn't act super nicely when you're filming a weird survival show in their backyard, but it still just seems bad and weird and gross for the show to frame it the way that it does. I doubt that this actually would have affected the amount of people who were viewing it back in 2013, 2014, especially the audiences for survival shows, but I don't know. I wanted to mention it. I think it's weird. It kind of puts me off for watching it. The entire show has a pretty, like, military, nationalistic vibe, which, especially in this day and age when there's so much nationalism, it's not my favorite thing to watch. And I wouldn't exactly suggest watching this if you don't like to see stuff like this. And that sucks. That's bad. That means their viewership is getting lower. I don't know, you just end up getting bad vibes from these people despite how fun they are because of the whole ex-cop, ex-military, nationalist, sometimes misogynist behavior that they show throughout the show. Like, I mean, really, do you want to spend time around somebody like Tom Moore? Because I really don't. And that does contribute, I think, to who would watch the show. But speaking of Tom Moore, so I want to start off by saying, for legal reasons, this is pure speculation. I haven't been able to fact check any of this. I honestly wouldn't include it in the video if this video wasn't just silly and I thought this was funny. But I read a really wild review on IMDb because this whole time I had gotten really weird vibes from Tom. I did not like him. His episode is atrocious. The way he's portrayed in the show, even before his episode, it didn't pass the smell check, if you will. So let's read this review real quick and let's see what it has to say. The review reads, I enjoy the camaraderie of the show very much, but the survival was not truthful and the entire show was so produced that none of the scenarios were remotely possible. But mainly I was really put off by the fake Colonel Moore character. Being a survivalist, veteran, and host myself, I like to do my diligence. I found Moore had put himself in to be a Kentucky colonel back when they could self-submit. Their rules clearly say it is fraudulent to hold the rank out as real. Yet Thomas Moore uses the rank to fool folks into donating money to fund his trips abroad to other countries known for unsavory practices. I did an FOIA, or Freedom of Information Act, request on Moore, and his actual military record was far from stellar. This explains why he misleads with his honorary rank. Moore served for a few years on active duty in the 70s, and he tried out for Special Forces and failed. He quit the military, then joined the reserve a decade later for at least a few years in the 80s, and again, he quit and left for a decade. Then, after failing in the civilian world again, Moore joined the Guard. Again, he served only a few years and then quit, and his records show he did attend a few schools, but never anything elite or survival. The most concerning fact is that he never obtained a rank higher than specialist, and he did something bad that warranted them to reduce his rank, usually as a result of a court-martial. The bottom line is that Thomas Moore has a very checkered and inglorious past, and he managed to dupe Kentucky into an honorary title which he has subsequently used to sell books and solicit funds for what appears to be less than honorable activities in underdeveloped nations. I cannot tell you how validated I felt after this, and I think really it speaks larger to the show and similar shows and their problems. Not that all of these guys are con men banking off of some weird reputation that's highly exaggerated, though I wouldn't say that's not what's happening in a lot of these cases, but honestly, that doesn't really matter. I think if he's doing questionable stuff, obviously that should be talked about. I don't think he should be in the show any longer, but he wasn't in the show past season 2. I think it points to the fact that there's nothing really tangible to hold on to in this show. No real titles, no actual information. It's all just nothing. It's all made up. It romanticizes the lives of these tough, manly dudes when they're probably nothing like the way they are in the show, especially when we can actively see the holes in their background. And, it doesn't matter for the show. I know Jake also has some strong criticism thrown around at him online, not just for being annoying, but for kind of being his own kind of con man, banking off of a couple achievements to act like he's the person to write books and do TV shows and give leadership seminars, even though he's not very good at it. I can't claim that any of this is true. I've never even experienced any of his leadership seminars, and we know that Jake has had some actual success in leadership, but it just makes these people and the entire show at large feel silly and hollow and kind of troublesome. I don't want to watch the alleged liar and con man who's allegedly hurting people in other countries, Tom Moore, fail at a game that then the show plays up how cool and epic he is because he's, an old military guy, even though his title alone is fake. It doesn't sit right with me, and I honestly don't want to watch anything like this show again. And I don't know if this would have played into viewership at all. I don't think anyone cares about Tom Moore and his 2 appearances on the entire show, but it certainly would contribute to my viewership of it, and it'll probably contribute to your guys' viewership of it. So I do think this is important to list as one of the major problems of the show, is that none of these people really have much integrity. They're all over-the-top characters that the show plays up as over-the-top, and over-the-top situations that are all fake. And it makes the entire show feel fake, which is so antithetical to stuff that I like when it comes to competition survival shows. Stuff like, it's not even a survival show, but stuff like Amazing Race is really fun because it's people, and it's played up for reality, of course, but it's people, and I don't think there really are any people on this show besides maybe John. Maybe Terry, I don't know, maybe these people are like this. I'm not one to say, but it definitely doesn't help this show be engaging, especially next to stuff like Naked and Afraid, which gets kind of normal feeling people on there sometimes. Okay, man. This has gotten a little ridiculous. We're up to 31 pages, and who knows what this runtime will end up being. This was supposed to be a quick video about sharing a goofy show I had seen, and now it's all of this. And the question I'm left with is, why? Why does it matter that this show is practically forgotten, that it didn't do well when it was on air, that it's got some weird dated elements and questionable things? Why did I talk about it this long? And honestly, it comes back to how I started the video, talking about how I grew up watching this stuff with my family. And this show, even with my mom later on, because we thought it looked stupid, and I'm missing home a lot. So it's nice to return to this silly show and poke some fun at it, remember it, and its follies. I think most people probably enjoy watching at least something that's not great with people they love. And this show, for as dumb as it sounds, is one of those things for me. I'm currently writing this section on a train headed from Paris to Brussels. I just spent 2 weeks in France, and I'm headed back home to Brussels. Home. I first called Brussels my home without thinking about it about 2 months after I had been here, and it got me thinking. This isn't what I would call my home. My home is 4,000 miles across the ocean. My family, my girlfriend, the people I know, the places I know are all there. I don't intend on living in Europe long term, but here I am. For now, this is home. And I guess anything can be home temporarily, as long as you're with people you love, making memories, experiencing new things, remembering old things. Home can be a school you're only at temporarily because of money. It can be a song, a smell, and as dumb as it sounds, home can be one of the worst reality TV survival shows I've ever seen. And spending way too long talking about it has been nice. I've always used this channel to help work through things in my life, and at the moment I'm halfway through my current stay in Europe, missing my home at home. So there isn't really a big moral here about reality TV because there's so much else you could have said better about it, and this show isn't even the best to talk about with it, and so many other people have already commented on it, so whatever. I honestly don't wish the show was better. It is what it is, and that is so much more interesting to me right now than just some fine survival show. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video and it was any bit interesting at all. If you're missing your home too, maybe take some time to watch something dumb you watched with your family or friends. Laugh at it and share it with your new friends and your new family. And keep your head up. It's a big world full of hurt, but hey, at least we always have Tom Moores to laugh at.
Cameraman's diary said, I knew I was okay wearing a wetsuit, but Terry was going to be in major trouble. I don't know how he survived the night. Once the sun went down, it was the worst. Terry went into shock, shaking uncontrollably. The cold water was sucking the life out of both of us. The rocking of the boat continued to be paralyzing, and once we lost sight of the horizon, it was absolutely terrible. The worst.
It was definitely bad, you know?
Terry, you don't have to sell me on how bad it was, because I couldn't watch the screen because I was getting seasick watching it.